Hello everyone, this is Dawn with the Twice Sheared Sheath, and this week for Technique Thursday we're going to talk about lifelines. Lifelines are like the redo button for lace knitting. Now because lace requires a lot of manipulation of stitches, of yarn overs and knit two togethers and all of that sort of stuff, it's really easy to make a mistake or to accidentally drop a stitch. And because the pattern can be so complicated, it can be really difficult to fix that mistake. And heaven forbid you should have to unravel your knitting and go back down. You have a very difficult time figuring out how to reset that so that it is at a point that is correct. That's where a lifeline comes in. So a lifeline is just a smooth string or stretch of yarn that you put through your loops on your needles in order to save that point in your knitting. It's like a save button that if you ever reach a point where you need to unravel your knitting, you can take your knitting off of your needles and pull all of that work out without any fear, because it will stop it right there on that lifeline and it can't go any farther than that. So on my knitting, I like to install multiple lifelines. As you can see, that I do it at a certain point in the pattern. If I need to do a repeat, I'll put a lifeline in after each repeat. In my knitting, you can see that I've left all my lifelines in because they're string. You can either leave the lifelines in, or you can put a lifeline in and then pull out the previous one if you want, if it bothers you to have multiples. It doesn't really bother me. In order to keep the string from pulling out on the back side, I have a tendency that I will just tie the two ends together on the back side so that it can't pull out of the edges of the knitting. Okay, so how do we install a lifeline? Well, the easiest way to install a lifeline is if you are using interchangeable needles. You see you've got this little hole right here. You can simply put your crochet cotton or other fine thread to tie that, stick that through that little hole and tie it to your needle like so. And then when you knit your next round, it will automatically pull that thread through your knitting along with your needle. And then once you've done all of your stitches, at the end you just cut your string on each end of the knitting and tie it together across the back. Simple as that. If you are using an interchangeable needle, you can simply leave a cable through your stitches and pull off your ends and put stoppers on, and then start with a brand new cable and needles on the next row, and just leave this cable hanging in your knitting as your lifeline. And then when you get ready to put in your next lifeline, you would just leave that previous cable up here and pull this one out and start knitting with that one. So you would need two cables for your needles then. But if you are not using an interchangeable needle and don't have either of these options, a nice little darning needle and your string is perfectly acceptable. So if you're putting your lifeline through with a darning needle, all you're going to do is go through and very carefully put your needle through each stitch, working your way all the way across, and run your string right next to that needle. If your yarn is very fine or it's very tight, this can be a little difficult. You might want a finer gauge needle so that you can really get it in there in between the needle and the stitches. And just run that all the way through and cut off the ends and tie it on the back side if you want to hold it. Now, a word of caution about stitch markers. I like to use stitch markers with lace. It helps me keep track of pattern repeats or sections like the center stitch. However, you need to be very careful that when you run your lifeline through your stitches, that you either run it around your stitch markers, not through your stitch markers, or that you use removable type stitch markers. Because if you run your lifeline through your stitches by either tying it onto the end of your needle or if you've got a cable that you are using to do that, and you don't have removable stitch markers, you're going to essentially weave your stitch markers into your knitting. So right here I used my Mobius ring markers, and I wasn't paying attention, and I ran my lifeline straight through my stitch markers. You can see now that they are not removable, and so they are stuck on that lifeline. And I have essentially woven my stitch markers onto my knitting. Now, of course, those will come right off when I pull out the lifeline at the end, that when you're all done with your knitting, you pull out all your lifelines and it's like they never existed. But for the meanwhile, those are just kind of sitting there dangling from my knitting until I pull that out. I know it may feel like a lifeline is a kind of burdensome step to have to do, and one more thing that you need to think about, and you may say, oh, I know what I'm doing, I can read my knitting, I'm sure that I will be okay, that I won't need a lifeline, or may say, oh, well, just give me 2 more rows and then I'll put in a lifeline. Inevitably, when you say that is when you make a horrible mistake, or your dog gets a hold of your knitting and carries it across the room, or your 2-year-old, and half the stitches have fallen off the needles and you cry and sob in a corner. So, trust me, use a lifeline, use it often, make sure that you've got a safety net when knitting lace. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye!